Hey everybody, it's Todd Bishop from GeekWire here with GeekWire podcast producer Claire McGrain.
Hello, Todd.
Andrew is out this week. We're going to be back next week with a brand new episode. But in the meantime, something happened today that Claire and I just had to talk about.
Yes, as the resident podcast experts at GeekWire. This is really exciting for us.
I would call you the expert, Claire. I'm just a poser. As usual.
Aficionados, maybe.
That's right. On this show, I'm just along for the ride. But Google is coming out apparently today with a new Google Podcasts app. And this was leaked overnight on the site Product Hunt. It's fascinating in part because Android users historically have not had a great experience for podcasts. And this really starts to change that, or at least it appears to.
Yeah, definitely. And in the podcast world, iTunes, now Apple Podcasts have really reigned supreme. That was the way that podcasts kind of got traction. It came on everyone's iPhone, when iPhones obviously are one of the most popular devices in the world. So it's exciting to finally see Google say, we need our own native podcast app. This is a medium that we need to be paying attention to. And I think it's really exciting because it is going to make it a lot easier for more people to get into podcasts because they now have this native experience that comes on the device they're using all the time.
That's right. So this will be available initially through the Google Play Store. As of this recording, it is not yet available, but here's a trick that you can use. If you have on your Android device, and by the way, only Android for now, this is not an iOS app, but if you have on your Android device the Google Search app, you can search for the name of a podcast. For example, Geared Up Podcast or GeekWire Podcast, just to give you a couple suggestions there. And within those search results on the phone, you will see the ability to play the audio file directly within the search results. You can click through to subscribe to essentially have a native experience for podcasts on your Android phone that did not exist before.
Yeah, and another thing that I think is interesting about this, and we'll see more of this once the app is, formally launched and people have a little bit more time to dig into it, but there's supposed to be an element that is Netflix-like, where it's suggesting shows to you. What do you think of that, Todd?
I think that's really cool because I end up, for all of the podcast suggestions that everybody shares, I'll forget them or I'll come to the end of one of my favorite podcasts. This happens with How I Built This, which is one of my favorite podcasts these days. It's an NPR show. And I get to the end of it and I'm like, I want more like that. And then I'm doing the search manually. Mm-hmm. And so I think that recommendation engine, depending on how good it is, could be pretty powerful.
It could. And I think it could also really help podcasts that are a little bit more under the radar right now, independent podcasts or podcasts that are on smaller networks, because a lot of people know about kind of the big names, the This American Lifes, the NPR shows that are very popular that have a lot of kind of clout behind them. I think it'll be exciting to see what new things it unearths for me. Like, I'm curious. There's probably tons of podcasts out there that are just smaller, so I haven't heard about them, but that I would really like.
The other feature that really caught my attention, because this addresses a pain point for me, is the synchronization between the Google Podcasts app and the Google Home speakers via the Google Assistant. I have this happen all the time where I'll be listening to a podcast on my way home. I get home and I would like to look over to my Echo speaker and say, Alexa, keep listening to that podcast that I was just listening to on my phone. And there are ways to do it. You can connect via Bluetooth from your phone to some Echo speakers, but it's just so wonky, and it would be really nice to have a seamless experience. That is essentially what Google is promising here between the Android app and Google Home. So you're still within the Google ecosystem. It's not ideal. You don't get to use your iPhone or your Echo device to do this. Even if you were able to get the Google app, the Google Podcast app on your iPhone, you wouldn't be able to do it right now. So you're still in that Google ecosystem. You have to have the Google Podcasts app and Android to be able to make it work on the home speakers. But still, it's a step forward, and I think it's an interesting feature, especially if you're already using those devices.
And you know what would really be the kicker for me as someone who does have a phone and a still-in-the-box Google Home device at home, which this might actually prompt me to actually unbox that and finally start using it. But the real kicker would be if I could be listening to a podcast using a desktop app on my laptop. So this happens to me all the time. I'll be at work or I'll be at my volunteer gig or I'll sometimes even just be at home, I'll start listening to the new episode of, say, This American Life on desktop, and then I'll need to go somewhere and hop in my car or hop on the bus and think, oh, well, it'd be great if I could just keep listening on my phone. And I have to go through and figure out where I was and backtrack a little bit. And, oh, did I hear this part already? Similar to what you were saying, that would be a really nice system. A question for you, though, Todd. You recently made the switch from Mac to Windows, so you're moving out of the Apple market. If this was a really cool feature on Android devices that you couldn't get on your iPhone, would you consider switching?
I would, but see, then to get the feature I really want, which is the synchronization with the smart speaker, I'd also have to swap out all the Echo devices. So that's where it's really too bad. I think the dream of all these tech companies, I should say, the dream of all tech users is to have interoperability between all sorts of devices, all sorts of platforms. And I think that was a hope that we would get that as we got into these smart devices, the smartphones that we're carrying around. But it seems like the tech industry just naturally goes into its own silos, and we're seeing that continue to happen here.
I think if Google was smart, they would not make it an iOS app. You would need to have an Android device to use it, but they would make it work on Alexa and other smart home platforms. I think that would be the best move there.
I guess the question is, what's more important to Google to protect, Android, or is it more important for them to build their Google Home market share? Because that's essentially what they're doing. They're using the exclusivity as a tool to build interest and demand for whatever platform they want to build it for. So
that's a really good point.
Yeah. So I got to tell you, though, I'm going to date myself here, but there actually was a really good Google Podcasts app back in the day. It was called Google Listen. It's since been retired, but I loved it. Gosh, this must have been, I remember where I discovered this. This must have been back in 2008 or 9, I think. So about 10 years ago. The thing I loved about it was the search functionality, which plays directly into Google's strength. You could search on the Google Listen app, and it would not only search the titles of the podcasts and the titles of the episodes, but the content, at least the description, to the extent that you could figure out what it was. So I used this all the time. Like if there was a topic I was following, I would search for shows about that topic. In fact, it was like the Jay Leno dispute with NBC or something. For some reason, I really got into that back when it happened. And so I would just search Jay Leno on the Google Listen app. I'm told this is the era that it was. and I would find all these episodes about it and think about how powerful that would be. I think one thing that would be cool is to check out the app, and you just did it. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just Googled Apple to see what would come up, and it suggested to me Mac Break Weekly, which seems to be a podcast about Apple, like a weekly show about Apple's technology, and then the Accidental Tech podcast. So it seems like that's kind of what they're building in.
Yeah, but I bet those podcasts have Apple in their description, and I bet that's why it's pulling up. The idea would be a random podcast that might be about a completely different topic normally, but that week they talked about Apple.
Oh, okay.
If it could surface that level of detail, and maybe it will, but that to me was the power of the Google Listen app, which is no longer available. At any rate.
Yeah, one other thing I wanted to say, just even quickly looking through this app, I really like how it's laid out. So one of the reasons that I don't use Stitcher, which is kind of the go-to on Android, is I don't really like the layout of it. It's hard to find the individual episodes and check all the shows that I like for the individual episodes. But the layout of the Google Podcasts app, at least to the extent that I've used it in the last, hour, seems very intuitive, and it gives you several different ways of looking at this content that you subscribe to, as well as content that's top and trending that you might be interested in. So there's a small plug. I think that's one of the things that Android apps in particular have struggled with, is getting that easy to use, consistent layout that people can actually figure out easily.
One other thing that Google announced that we have not talked about yet is they're trying to get more people into podcasting through this whole effort. This is a quote from the blog post, which is now live. It was not live when we posted about this earlier on GeekWire. They say, quote, "While there are more podcasts than ever before, there continues to be an imbalance in who is creating them. Looking at the top charts, only about a quarter of the most popular podcasts tend to be hosted by women and even fewer by people of color." So what they're doing is they're creating this program designed to increase the diversity of voices in podcasting. They're going to have an advisory board. They're going to teach people how to make podcasts and basically try and promote underrepresented voices in podcasts.
Yeah, and I think that's a great mission to have. It'll be exciting to see where they go. I think that has a real shot at succeeding given Google's reach.
All right, so that is a quick look at the Google Podcasts app. You should be able to find it soon, if not already, in the Google Play Store. Claire, before we close, let's hear your current favorite podcast or recommendation.
Ooh, so upon the recommendation of another person, I've been listening to the backlog of Harry Potter and the Sacred Text. Do you know about this?
Is this the J.K. Rowling kind of special episode or special book or theater? What is it?
No. So this is a podcast run by two people, a humanist, kind of atheist chaplain, and a man who I don't know exactly what school of divinity he's in, but he's, I think when the podcast starts, in a divinity graduate school. And they read Harry Potter and use like literary analysis that you would use on the Bible or the Quran or other kind of sacred texts and read it as though everything has a purpose and meaning, and J.K. Rowling didn't make silly mistakes all the time. So it's just a very kind of fun, peaceful, relaxing podcast to listen to.
Really?
Yeah.
So what was the name again?
Harry Potter and the Sacred Text.
Okay, I'll definitely have to check that out. On the complete other end of the spectrum, it's religious for some people, but not technically religious. I really like the podcast Acquired. I've sort of gotten back into it lately. This is produced by two folks here in the Seattle region. One of them's now in the Bay Area, actually, Ben Gilbert and David Rosenthal. They've got a long history in Seattle startups at Microsoft and Madrona Venture Group and Pioneer Square Labs. What they do is they look at tech acquisitions and they analyze it with this fascinating framework. They have guests on. They did a really good one recently looking into the Microsoft and GitHub acquisition. I had covered that, been on all the conference calls, talked to analysts about it, and they were able to say things that were news to me and interesting to me. So they're really advancing these stories when they talk about the tech acquisitions, and it's a really interesting one. So that's Acquired, and you can find it at acquired.fm.
Cool. Or in the Google Podcasts app, apparently.
Apparently, absolutely. All right, so that is a quick take on the new Google Podcasts app. Andrew Edwards will be back next week on Geared Up. Until next time, I'm Todd Bishop.
And I am special guest, Claire McGrain.
We'll talk to you next time on Geared Up on GeekWire.